The emergency broadcast cut through every communication channel in the Galactic Council chambers like a blade through silk, and the assembled representatives from 47 worlds turned their attention to the holographic display that flickered. To life above the central podium, Belthani appeared on screen, and her aquatic features were twisted in desperation, and her translucent skin pulsed with distress colors that any spacefaring species would recognize as pure terror. And behind her, the background showed water facilities burning and the screams of her people echoing through the Assyrian's transmission. "This is Colony Administrator. It's the Shah of the Velthani homeworld, and we are under attack by Kresh Dominion forces," she gasped, and her breathing apparatus struggled to function through what was clearly toxic smoke. "They have breached our outer defenses and are demanding our complete surrender and enslavement. And our military forces are depleted, and we have nowhere to run, and our children are dying, and please, and anyone who can hear this, and we need help." The transmission cut to static, and the council chamber erupted into frantic discussion, and Councillor Vex of the Rathani Confederacy called for order in his four arms, gesturing for silence, and the chamber gradually quieted to a tense murmur. "We have all witnessed this tragedy," Vex announced, and his voice carried the weight of his 3 centuries of diplomatic service. "The question before us is clear, and can we mount a rescue operation for the Velthani people?" The Galactic Defense Coordinator and a methodical being from the silicon-based Porthan species, and activated a strategic display that showed the distance between Council space and the Velthani system, and the numbers were not encouraging. The Velthani homeworld is located 17,000 light-years from the nearest Council fleet position. The coordinator stated in a tone devoid of emotion. "Standard jump protocols would require 6 weeks minimum for our fastest vessels to arrive. The Kresh will have completed their occupation within 72 hours, and additionally, the Kresh have committed a fleet of 214 vessels to this operation, and we would need to mobilize at least 400 ships to ensure victory, and such a mobilization would leave our core systems vulnerable." Councillor Vex nodded slowly, and his expression grave. "Then we are agreed, and we lack the capability to intervene," he said, in the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We will prepare refugee facilities for any Velthani who manage to escape, and we will lodge a formal protest with the Kresh Dominion, and we will impose economic sanctions." The vote was quick and efficient, and 39 species voted to accept the limitations of reality, and 8 abstained, and none voted for intervention, because none believed it possible, and the Velthani were condemned by mathematics and logistics and the cold calculations of strategic necessity. The message of regret was composed and transmitted, and the council moved on to other business, because the galaxy was large and tragedy was common, and sometimes there was simply nothing to be done. But the Velthani distress call had not only reached the council chambers, and the broadcast had spread across all standard emergency frequencies, and on a small blue world at the edge of what the galaxy considered civilized space, and other ears been listening. Earth's Deep Space Monitoring Station Delta had picked up the transmission within minutes of its initial broadcast, and Lieutenant Commander Jackson Torres had been the first human to hear this desperate plea, and he had immediately routed it to Earth. Defense Coalition headquarters in Geneva. Admiral Rebecca Okonkwo stood in the Situation Room, and her hands pressed flat against the tactical display table, and around her, the military and civilian leadership of humanity's unified defense force watched the Velthani broadcast for the 3rd time. "The Galactic Council has declined to intervene," reported her intelligence officer and commander. Chen had pulled up the Council's official response. "They cite distance and force disparity and defensive concerns, so they're just going to let these people die," said President Alina Volkov, and her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Admiral Okonkwo studied the star charts, and her mind already calculating jump vectors and fuel requirements and crew endurance limits. "The Council says 6 weeks minimum travel time," she said quietly. "Their ships and their crews and their limitations." She looked up and met the president's eyes. "We can do it in 2 weeks." The room fell silent, and everyone present understood what that meant. In human vessels could make jumps that would hospitalize most galactic species, and human crews could endure acceleration that would kill a Rithania or rupture Rithania, Corthan's crystalline structure and human determination, had always been humanity's most dangerous weapon. The Third Fleet, Okonkwo continued. 27 ships and full combat loadout, and we can launch within 6 hours. Defense Secretary William Chen leaned forward. Rebecca and the Kresh have over 200 vessels, and we'd be going in with less than 30? Yes, sir, Okonkwo replied, and her expression hard as titanium. But they're not expecting us, and they're not expecting human weapons, and they're definitely not expecting anyone to show up at all. President Volkov walked to the window, and looking out over the city of Geneva, and thinking of all the times in human history when good people had stood by and done nothing while others suffered, and she thought of the promises humanity had made after discovering they were not alone in the universe, and never again would become a universal principle and not just a human one. How many crew members are we talking about? She asked. 43,000 personnel, Okonkwo answered. All volunteers and all aware of the risks. Volkov turned back to face the room. And if we do this and the political consequences with the Council, some species will call us warmongers, Ambassador Marcus Webb said from his position at the table. Some will call us reckless, and some will be terrified of us, he paused. And some will quietly be grateful that someone still believes that doing the right thing matters more than doing the safe thing. The president nodded slowly and then straightened. Her shoulders, Admiral Okonkwo, and you are authorized to deploy the Third Fleet to the Valthani system, and rules of engagement are at your discretion, and bring those people home. Yes, ma'am, Okonkwo said, and she was already moving toward the door, and already calling up her command staff, and already composing the order that would send 43,000 humans across the galaxy to fight for people they had never met within. The hour the word had spread through the Third Fleet's berths. In lunar orbit, and crews raced to their stations, and supply officers loaded munitions, and ordnance and engineers ran final checks on jump drives and weapons. Systems Commander Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the HDCS Indomitable and the fleet's flagship and watched her crew work with practiced efficiency, and she pulled up the Valthani distress call one more time and watched Thessia's terrified face. All ships report ready for departure. Her executive officer announced Chen opened a fleet-wide channel. This is Commander Chen to all Third Fleet vessels, and we have our orders, and somewhere out there, people are dying because they believe nobody is coming. She paused and letting her words sink in. Let's prove them wrong, and let's show the galaxy what humans do when someone asks for help. In all ships, and jump on my mark. The fleet's jump drive spun up in reality, began to bend around 27 human warships, and in the Galactic Council chambers, the representatives were still debating the proper wording for their formal protest to the Kresh Dominion. They had no idea that the Deathworlders had already left. The HDC's Indomitable shuddered as it dropped out of its fourth jump in 6 days, and the crew had stopped counting the stress warnings from the ship's medical AI because every human on board had already exceeded the recommended G-force exposure by 200%, and nobody cared. Commander Sarah Chen gripped her command chair as another wave of nausea passed through her. And the anti-nausea medication only did so much when you were compressing 6 weeks of travel into 2, and her executive officer and Lieutenant Marcus Rivera, and looked even worse than she felt, but his hands remained steady on his console. Jump completion confirmed, Rivera announced, and his voice rough from the stimulant pills they were all taking to maintain combat readiness. All 27 ships accounted for, and engines at 68% efficiency and jump drives recharging for sequence 5. Chen nodded and pulled up the tactical display, and they had covered another 3,000 light-years. And the Valthani system was getting closer, but not fast enough, and never fast enough. Status of the crew, she asked the medical officer, and Dr. Yuki. Tanaka-an appeared on her secondary screen, and the woman looked exhausted but functional. 15 cases of severe jump sickness, and 3 crew members with stress fractures from the G-forces, and everyone's pushing their limits. But nobody's asked to stand down, and morale is actually holding steady. That didn't surprise Chen, and humans had always been at their best when fighting for something bigger than themselves, and right now, 43,000 people were united by a single purpose, and get to the Valthani before the Kresh finished what they started. How much time before we can jump? Again, Chen asked her chief engineer commander Jackson Torres. appeared on screen and grease smudged across his face for hours if you want the drives to last, and 2 hours if you're willing to risk a catastrophic failure in ma'am. Chen said without hesitation, "We didn't come this far to arrive late because we were being careful." Torres grinned in a tired but genuine expression.
"Yes, ma'am."
"And I'll have my people ready." Chen closed the channel and pulled up the intelligence files on the Kresh Dominion that Earth's Sinology Department had compiled. And the Kresh were a proud warrior culture, but their concept of warfare was nothing like humanity's Kresh, fought according to ancient traditions and formal declarations of intent and positioning of fleets in pre-arranged battle formations and exchanges of challenges and demands before weapons fire, and it was all very civilized and very predictable and very different from how humans approached combat. Humans had learned warfare on a world that tried to kill them every single day, and Earth had taught humanity that hesitation meant death, and that fair fights were for sports, and that when something threatened your survival, you hit it with everything you are. And you didn't stop until the threat was eliminated. Chun had studied Earth's military history extensively, and from the ancient Romans, built roads so they could march legions faster than anyone expected, and to the Mongols who conquered empires through speed and shock tactics, and to the modern era where precision strikes could eliminate targets before enemies knew they were under attack. This galaxy fought wars like chess matches, and humanity fought wars like a cornered Wolverine commander, Rivera said, and pulling her from her thoughts, "We're picking up galactic news. Network traffic, and they're talking about us." Chen raised an eyebrow, put it on screen. A holographic alien appeared, and some species Chen didn't recognize, and the being's multiple eye stalks were focused intently on the camera. In what many are calling a foolhardy gesture, and the human Third Fleet continues its impossible journey to the Velthani system, and experts estimate the human vessels will suffer catastrophic drive failures before completing half the journey, and the Kresh Dominion has issued a statement warning humanity not to interfere in what they call an internal matter of consolidation. Another alien appeared, and this one a Rithani diplomat. Humanity simply doesn't understand galactic realities, and they are a young species and impulsive, and they see a distress call and react emotionally without considering the strategic implications, and it is tragic, but the Velthani situation was already decided by the mathematics of distance and force projection, and the humans are going to get themselves killed for nothing. Chen muted the broadcast and looked around her bridge. Her crew had heard every word, and she saw the determination in their eyes harden into something sharper. "They think we don't understand," she said quietly. "They think we're rushing in, blind and emotional and stupid." She stood from her chair. "They're wrong about the stupid part, and we know exactly what we're doing, and we understand the odds, and we understand the risks, and we're doing this anyway, because sometimes the right thing to do is also the hard thing, and that's what separates us from people who sit in comfortable chambers and debate while innocents die." The bridge crew erupted in a chorus of affirmations. And these were men and women who had volunteered for this mission, knowing they might not come home, and knowing the galaxy thought they were fools and not caring because the Velthani needed help, and that was enough. Rivera, Chen said, "Pull up everything we have on Kresh military doctrine, and I want to know how they position their fleets and how they communicate and how they think over the next 2 hours while the jump drives recharged." And Chen and her tactical team dissected every scrap of intelligence on the Kresh, and the pattern was clear, and the Kresh expected warfare to follow rules, and they positioned their heavy cruisers in the center of formations and their lighter vessels on the flanks, and they always transmitted formal challenges before opening fire. "They're going to hail us," Chen said, "and studying the tactical projections when we arrive, and they're going to demand we identify ourselves and state our intentions and declare our allegiance, and they'll expect us to position our fleet and wait for their response, and then engage in the formal dance of fleet combat." "What are we actually going to do?" Rivera asked, and though he already knew the answer, Chen smiled, and cold and predatory. "We're going to drop in at maximum weapons range and acquire firing solutions before they finish saying hello and unlaunch everything we have before they realize we're not following their rules." She opened a recording channel, and her message would be transmitted to Kresh Command. The moment the fleet arrived in the Velthani system, this is Commander Sarah Chen of the Human Defense. Coalition 3rd Fleet, 2 Kresh Dominion forces currently occupying the Velthani system, she said, and her voice calm and absolutely certain. You have one opportunity to withdraw immediately and leave now, and this is your only warning. Short and simple and direct, and no flowery language, and no formal declarations. And no negotiation, and just a statement of fact, and the Kresh could leave, or they could face the consequences, and Chen didn't particularly care which they chose. Jump drives at full charge. Torres reported all ships ready for Sequence 5. Chen settled back into her command chair and pulled up the countdown. Timer and 8 more days of brutal jumps and 8 more days of pushing her crew and her ships past every safety limitation and 8 more days until they reached the Velthani All. Ships in jump on my mark, she announced to the fleet, the 3rd Fleet. Vanished from normal space and racing across the galaxy at speeds that would have impressed the ancient mariners, who first dared to sail beyond sight of land and humanity had always been a species of explorers and of wanderers and of people who ran toward danger when others ran away on. The Velthani homeworld and Administrator Vesha huddled with the survivors of her government in an underwater bunker and watched as Kresh soldiers patrolled the streets of their cities, and the Council's message of regret had arrived, informal and apologetic and useless. She had stopped hoping for rescue, and now she just hoped that some of her people would survive long enough to reach the refugee stations. The Council had prepared. Thesha had no way of knowing that help was coming, and that 27 human warships were tearing across space at impossible speeds, and that 43,000 Deathworlders were coming to save people they had never met, and that the Kresh Dominion was about to learn a very hard lesson about what happens when you hurt someone and a human hears about it. The galaxy was about to discover that humans didn't send aid, and they sent fleets. The Kresh Fleet Commander Surthex stood on the bridge of his flagship and the Crimson Talon, and surveying the pacified Velthani homeworld with satisfaction, and the operation had gone exactly according to traditional protocols, and his fleet of 214 vessels had positioned themselves in the ceremonial formation of dominance, and the Velthani had been given the customary 3 days to consider surrender, and they had accepted their fate as all civilized species eventually did. Now came the administrative phase in processing the Velthani for assignment to labor colonies and cataloging their resources and establishing the proper tribute schedules, and it was all very routine and very proper, and exactly as warfare should be conducted between spacefaring civilizations. Fleet Commander, his sensor officer announced, and his vocal sacs inflating with concern. We have multiple contacts emerging from jump space at the system perimeter. Zarthex's attention sharpened. The Council has finally decided to lodge their protest in person. He mused. How many vessels? 27 contacts, and configuration unknown. The officer replied, They are not broadcasting identification and weight, and Commander, and they are moving at combat speed directly toward our position. That was unusual, and proper protocol demanded that any approaching fleet first transmit their intentions and request permission to approach and establish their diplomatic status before entering. Weapons range. Hail them, Zarthex commanded. Demand they identify themselves and state their purpose. The communications officer worked his console and then looked up in confusion. Commander, and we are receiving a transmission, but it is very brief. Zarthex ordered. A human appeared on screen, and female, and wearing a military uniform that Zarthex didn't recognize, and her face was set in an expression of cold determination. This is Commander Sarah Chen of the Human Defense Coalition 3rd Fleet to Kresh Dominion forces currently occupying the Velthani system, and you have one opportunity to withdraw immediately and leave now, and this is your only warning. The transmission ended, and Zarthex stared at the blank screen in disbelief, and then began to laugh in a deep rumbling sound that echoed through the bridge. Humans, he said, and his amusement genuine. The Deathworlders have finally decided to play at galactic politics. He turned to his tactical officer. 27 ships against our 214, and do they not understand mathematics? Perhaps they come seeking diplomatic resolution, suggested his second-in-command. Then they should have said so in proper form, Zarthex replied. Prepare a formal response. And we will educate these primitives in the civilized conduct of fleet interactions and position the third battle group to intercept, and we will demonstrate the futility of their gesture without unnecessary destruction. And after all, and we would not want the council to think us barbaric. The response was being drafted when the censor officer's voice cut through the bridge chatter and hi. An alarmed commander and the human vessels are not slowing, and they are at .8 maximum. Velocity and weapons are going hot across their entire fleet. Would Zarthek spun to face the tactical display. They cannot mean to attack without even receiving our response, and that would be, and the display lit up with incoming fire in hundreds of projectiles launched from the human fleet and moving at velocities that made Zarthek's blood run cold. Evasive action, he shouted, but it was already too late. The first human railgun rounds struck the Kresh third battle group in 47. Ships that had been positioned in the traditional forward screening formation and the formation that assumed any enemy would announce their attack and allow proper defensive preparation. Depleted uranium slugs moving at relativistic speeds punched through Kresh shields like they weren't even there, and shields designed to deflect energy weapons and to absorb particle beams and to redirect plasma bursts, and they had never been tested against solid projectiles. It's moving at a significant fraction of light speed. The Kresh cruiser Valor's end disintegrated as a railgun round struck its reactor core, and the explosion took out two nearby destroyers and across the third battle group, and ships were reeling and their crews trying to understand what was happening. Return fire, Zarthek commanded, and his voice steady, despite the chaos. All vessels and engage the enemy. The Kresh fleet began to respond, and energy weapons tracking toward the approaching human ships, but the humans weren't. Where the Kresh expected them to be human vessels, twisted and rolled and executed maneuvers that should have turned their crews to paste against the bulkheads, and the ships moved like fighters instead of capital vessels, and like they were dancing through a debris field instead of engaging in proper fleet combat. How are they moving like that? Zarthek's tactical officer gasped. The G-forces should be killing their crews, but the humans weren't dying, and they were closing the distance, and they were launching more weapons and missiles that the Kresh point defense systems struggled to track, and nuclear-pumped plasma torpedoes that detonated against Kresh holes with devastating effect. The HDCS Indomitable led the human charge, and Commander Chen, standing on her bridge and watching the tactical display with clinical precision. Targets acquired. Her weapons officer announced firing solutions, locked all batteries and fire at will. Chen ordered the Indomitable's main railguns. Spoke in 6 rounds per minute per gun, in each round carrying the kinetic energy of a small asteroid impact, and around the flagship in 26, other human vessels were doing the same, and pouring fire into the Kresh formation. The Kresh are trying to reform, Rivera reported. They're pulling their heavy cruisers back and attempting to establish a proper battle line. Don't let them, Chen said. All ships and maintain pressure and target their command vessels, and we end this fast. The human fleet split into 3 groups, and each one driving into the Kresh formation from a different vector and breaking up any attempt at organized defense, and it was chaos, and it was brutal, and it was completely outside the Kresh understanding of how fleet combat should work on the Crimson Talon. And Zarthek watched his carefully organized fleet disintegrate into a confused melee, and ships were reporting damage and requesting instructions and trying to find enemies that refused to stay still long enough to target properly. They fight like animals, his second-in-command said. Man, horror in his voice. No, Zarthek replied, and cold realization settling over him. They fight like predators, and we have been practicing warfare as a ritual. For so long we forgot it could be something else, a human destroyer in the HDCS, relentless, and screamed past the Crimson Talon at a distance that would have been considered suicidally close by any Kresh captain, and as it passed in every weapon on its hull fired in a single, devastating broadside. The Crimson Talon's shields collapsed, and armor plating buckled, and secondary explosions rippled across 3 decks. Damage reports. Zarthek commanded shields offline, and weapons batteries 3 through 7 destroyed, and casualty reports coming in from multiple sections. His damage control officer reported another wave of human missiles swept through the Kresh fleet, and these ones targeted the troop transports that held captured Velthani. Civilians, but instead of exploding, and the missiles released clouds of electronic warfare drones that jammed Kresh communications and blinded their sensors. They are protecting the Velthani, Zarthek said, an understanding finally dawning. They did not come here to make a statement or to negotiate, and they came here to win. Commander, and we have lost 38 vessels with another 49 damaged and unable to maintain formation. His tactical officer reported the humans have lost in nothing and they have taken no significant damage. Zarthex looked at the tactical display and watched his superior. Numbers mean nothing against an enemy that refused to fight by the rules he understood, and the humans were everywhere, and moving too fast and hitting too hard, and they weren't stopping, Fleet Commander. His communications officer said quietly, "We are receiving hails from 17 of our captains, and they are requesting permission to withdraw in all his years of service." And Zarthex had never heard those words during a battle, and the Kresh did not retreat until after formal protocols had been followed, and until proper negotiations had determined the acceptable terms of disengagement. But the humans, clearly, didn't care about proper protocols. "Send a message to the human commander," Zarthex said. In his pride warring with his duty to preserve his fleet, request a ceasefire and open negotiations for our withdrawal. The message was sent, and Zarthex waited for the response, and expecting either diplomatic acknowledgement or demands for conditional surrender. What he got instead was 3 words from Commander Chen: "Leave and now." Not a negotiation and not terms, and just a command. "All vessels," Zarthex announced to his fleet, and the words tasting like ash, "begin jump preparations, and we are withdrawing from the Velthani system on the Velthani homeworld." An administrator Thesha stood in the bunker and watching the battle unfold on the orbital monitors that the Kresh had not yet discovered, and she watched impossible ships from an impossible species tier through a fleet that should have been unstoppable. The Galactic Council Chamber had never been so crowded, and representatives from 63 species packed the hall, and every news network in known space had cameras focused on the proceedings, and the emergency session had been called within hours of the Battle of Velthani. And as the engagement was already being called throughout the galaxy, Counselor Gex stood at the central podium, and his forearms spread wide for silence in the gesture barely needed, as the chamber was already thick with tension. "We convene to address the actions of the Human Defense Coalition in the Velthani system," Vex announced, and his voice carefully neutral. "The Kresh Dominion has filed formal complaints of 18 violations of galactic warfare conventions, and they demand sanctions and reparations in an immediate trial of human military leadership for war crimes." The Kresh representative, an ambassador, Krellin, stood, and his scales still bearing the discoloration of stress from his species' humiliating defeat. "The humans attacked without formal declaration," Krell hissed. "They refused negotiation, and they employed weapons specifically designed to circumvent our defensive systems, and they ignored every protocol of civilized warfare, and this is barbarism." And pure and simple murmurs of agreement rippled through certain sections of the chamber and species that valued tradition and order, and the comfortable predictability of warfare as they knew it. "The humans killed 38 of our vessels and wounded thousands of our warriors, and they did this without even attempting diplomatic resolution," Krell continued. "They are dangerous, and they are unpredictable, and they must be contained before they destabilize the entire galactic order." The Rithani delegation nodded their agreement, and several other species added their voices to the calls for human sanctions. Then Ambassador Marcus Webb stood, and the former Marine moving with the controlled grace of a career soldier, and he walked to the speaker's platform without hurry and without apparent concern for the hostile atmosphere. Ambassador Webb-Vex acknowledged, "The Council recognizes Earth's representative, and you may respond to these charges." Webb looked around the chamber, and his gaze touching on each delegation before he spoke. "The Kresh are correct that we did not follow your protocols," he said, and his voice carrying clearly through the space. "We did not issue formal declarations, and we did not position our fleet for ceremonial combat, and we did not negotiate before we started shooting." He paused. "We also did not let the Velthani die while we debated the finer points of diplomatic procedure." "You had no right to interfere," Krell shouted. The Velthani matter was an internal concern of the Kresh Dominion. The Velthani sent a distress call on open channels, Webb replied, and his tone sharp. That makes it everyone's concern, and/or it should, and if we actually mean all the high-minded words we use about galactic community and shared civilization. He activated a holographic display and showing the Velthani distress call and Thesh's terrified face and her desperate plea for help. This person and these people and asked for help. Webb said the council heard them, and you debated and you calculated, and you decided it was too hard and too risky and too expensive, and so you sent regrets and prepared refugee camps and assumed that was good enough. We acted according to strategic reality, Vex said, in defense of the distance and the force disparity and were irrelevant. Webb interrupted because you assumed everyone else had the same limitations you do and the same risk tolerance and the same unwillingness to sacrifice. For strangers, he pulled up footage from the battle and showing human ships executing maneuvers that made several council members visibly uncomfortable just watching. You want to know why we fight differently, Webb said. Let me tell you about Earth. And my species evolved on a Class 12 death world, and do you know what that means? He didn't wait for an answer. It means our planet tried to kill us every single day, and predators that could tear us apart, and diseases that could wipe out entire populations, and weather that could level cities, and plants that could poison us, and insects that could drain our blood, and other humans who wanted what we had. Webb's expression hardened. We learned to fight before we learned to farm, and we learned to work together before we learned to build cities, and we learned that hesitation meant death, and that fair fights were a luxury, and that when something threatened our survival, we hit it with everything we had, and we didn't stop until it was over. That is barbarism, Krell insisted. No, Webb said quietly. That is survival, and your species, and all of you, and developed on gentler worlds, and you had time to develop your rules and your protocols, and your civilized ways of conducting warfare. And that's wonderful, and I'm genuinely happy for you. His voice turned cold, but don't mistake our willingness to fight dirty for ignorance, and we know your rules, and we simply don't care about them when lives are at stake. The chamber erupted. In argument and species, shouting at each other and accusations flying, and Vex calling for order and barely maintaining control. Webb waited for the noise to die down before continuing. The Kresh want to charge us with war crimes, he said. Let's talk about crimes, and you invaded a peaceful world, and you were in the process of enslaving an entire species, and you were going to condemn millions of sentient beings to servitude, and you want us punished for stopping you. The Velthani had been given proper terms of surrender, Krell argued. They could have accepted and been treated according to convention. They could have been slaves instead of corpses. Webb translated how generous he turned to address the full council. Earth has a saying, and never again, and it comes from our history, and from times when evil was allowed to flourish because good people stood by and did nothing, and we promised ourselves, and we promised each other, and that we would never again let atrocity happen when we had the power to stop it. And you've decided this principle applies to the entire galaxy, Vex? Asked. Yes, Webb said simply. We have, and deal with it. The chamber fell silent, and the bluntness of the statement shocking in its audacity. You cannot impose your values on the rest of us. A Porthon representative argued. We're not imposing anything. Webb replied. We're offering an any species in any world, and that calls for help against existential threat, and we will answer. And we don't care about the odds, and we don't care about the distance, and we don't care about your rules, and we will come and we will fight, and we will protect those who cannot protect themselves. And if the council forbids this, Vex asked. Webb smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Then the council will have demonstrated that it values procedure over principle, and we will act anyway. And with or without your permission, and with or without your approval, you would defy the council. Krell said, an outrage in his voice. We would do what's right, Webb corrected. The council is welcome to join us. He pulled up another display, and this one showing star charts and communication logs. Since the Battle of Velthani, and we have received 47 requests for mutual defense agreements, and 17 species have asked for training in human military tactics, and 8 have requested to purchase human weapon systems. The council chamber buzzed with surprise, and many delegations, clearly unaware of this development it seems. Webb continued that not everyone shares your horror at our barbarism, and some species appreciate that there are still people willing to fight for something other than profit or territory as small. Delegation in the back of the chamber stood, and the Velthani had been given observer status for this session. An administrator, the Shah, stepped forward. "May I speak?" she asked. Thex hesitated, and then nodded. The council recognizes Administrator the Shah. The Shah approached the platform, and her aquatic features still showing signs of the trauma her people had endured. "I have listened to this debate with great interest," she said, in her voice soft but clear. "The Krish call the humans barbaric, and the council expresses concern about destabilization and I must ask, and where were all of you when my people were dying? The silence was absolute. We called for help." Vesha continued, "We begged and we pleaded, and you sent regrets and you sent excuses. And you sent nothing that mattered." She turned to Webb. "The humans came, and they asked for nothing in return, and they expect no tribute and no territory and no favors, and they simply came because we needed help and because it was the right thing to do." Tears ran down her face. "My people are free because the humans decided that our lives mattered more than their safety and more than galactic politics and more than the approval of this council, and you dare to call them barbaric for that." She looked around the chamber. "I propose a resolution, and any species that calls for help against existential threat shall receive immediate aid from any willing members, and no debate and no committees and no calculations of profit, and just help and just action and just doing what should be done." "That's absurd," Krell sputtered. "Such a policy would be chaos, it would be justice." Thesha replied. Webb stepped forward. "Earth formally supports Administrator Thesha's proposal, and we additionally propose that this resolution be called the Never Again Accords, and as a reminder of what happens when civilized people decide that some lives matter less than others." 3 months after the Battle of Velthani, and the galaxy had settled into an uneasy new normal, and the Never Again Accords existed on paper, but most species still believed that humanity's intervention had been a one-time event and an impulsive gesture that the Deathworlders would abandon. Once they understood the true costs of their promises, the Kresh Dominion had other ideas. Fleet Commander Zarthek stood once again on the bridge of a flagship, and this time the Obsidian Fang, and a newer and larger vessel that represented the Kresh response to their humiliation, and around him floated a fleet of 180 vessels, and smaller than their previous force, but equipped with new weapons and new tactics and new determination. "The Tertian mining colony ahead," his tactical officer reported. "Population approximately 40,000 and mixed species and NHEs. No significant defensive capabilities." Zarthek studied the strategic display, and the Tertian system was far from Earth, and far from Velthanian, positioned specifically to make human intervention difficult, and the Krish had chosen this target carefully. "This will demonstrate to the galaxy that humanity's protection is an illusion," Zarthek said to his assembled officers. "They cannot be everywhere, and they cannot save everyone. And once we prove this, and their precious accords will be revealed as the empty promise they truly are." He opened a channel to the Tertian colony. "This is Fleet Commander Zarthex of the Gresh Dominion, and your system is now under our control, and you have 12 hours to surrender and accept our terms or face the consequences." On the Tertian mining platform, an Administrator Cove received the message with shaking hands and his insectoid features clicking in distress. And the colony had 40,000 souls and 17 different species, and all working together to extract the rare minerals that made this barren system valuable. They had no warships, and they had no defense fleet, and they had nothing but a communications array and a desperate hope cove. "Opened a channel on all emergency frequencies. This is Administrator Cove of Tertian Station to anyone who can hear, and we are under attack by Kresh forces, and we request immediate assistance under the Never Again Accords, and please, and anyone, and we have families here, and we have children, and please help us." The message broadcast across known space, and reaching the Galactic Council, and reaching news networks, and reaching Earth, and reaching the Velthani Homeworld Administrator. Thesha was in a meeting with her reconstruction committee when the distress call came through, and she listened to Cove's terrified voice and remembered her own desperate plea months ago and remembered the impossible humans who had answered. She didn't hesitate. "Open a channel to our fleet command," she ordered. Her aide looked confused. "Administrator, and we don't have a fleet command, and we're still rebuilding our defense force. We do now," the Shah replied, and walking quickly toward the newly constructed Military Coordination Center 3 months ago. "And I authorized a special project, and it's time to see if it works in orbit above the Velthani homeworld." And Captain Myra 7 Current floated in the command sphere of the VNS Remembrance, and the first Velthani warship constructed using human engineering principles, and around her and 14 other vessels of the newly formed Velthani Defense Fleet waited. "We have received the distress call from Tershan," her tactical officer reported. "Earth has not yet responded." "Then we respond first," Myra said, and her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lost everything once and refused to let it happen. "Two others all ships, and prepare for immediate jump to Tershan system and send a message to Earth Defense Coalition and tell them we're going, and we would appreciate their company." The Velthani fleet jumped, and their ships were smaller than the human vessels, and their weapons were not as powerful, but they moved with the same aggressive purpose, and the same refusal to accept that distance was an excuse for inaction in Earth, and Admiral Rebecca Okonkwo was already mobilizing the 5th Fleet when the Velthani message arrived. "It jumped already," her communications officer reported, in surprise evident. 15 Velthani vessels en route to Tershan, an estimated arrival in 9 days. Okonkwo smiled. "Good for them," and signaled the 5th Fleet, "and we launch in 30 minutes, and let's make sure our friends have backup." The call went out across the galaxy, and species that had signed mutual defense pacts with humanity began to mobilize, and the Rithani contributed 12 ships. And the Porthon sent 8 crystalline vessels, and the Dravenin, who had been liberated from a similar situation just 6 weeks prior, and sent everything they had by the time the Kresh realized what was happening, and it was too late. Fleet Commander Zarthex watched his tactical display with growing horror as jump signatures began appearing at the edge of the Tershan system report. He commanded 15 Velthani vessels entering weapons range, his sensor officer said, and his voice climbing. 20 human ships behind them, and Rithani forces arriving, and Porthan Squadron detected, and Commander, and we're detecting 47 vessels total, and more signatures appearing. How Zarthex breathed. "How are they moving so fast?" His second in command. "Pulled up analysis reports the Velthani ships, and they are using human jump drive configurations, and the other species have been training with human fleet coordination protocols. And Commander, and they have all adopted human response times. Allied fleet didn't slow, and they didn't hail, and they didn't request negotiation." The Velthani ships came in first and firing weapons that mixed their traditional energy systems with human railgun technology, and their accuracy wasn't perfect, and their formations weren't as tight as human standards, but their determination was absolute. "Captain," Mira spoke to her fleet. 3 months ago we were victims, and today we choose to be defenders, and for Tershan, and for everyone who has ever called for help, and for the principle that some things are worth fighting for." The Velthani fleet crashed into the Kresh formation, and behind them, and the human 5th Fleet arrived, and Commander Jackson Torres leading from the HDC's defiant all ships, and the Velthani have softened them up. Torres announced, "Let's finish this in weapons free, and show them what happens when you test the accords." The combined fleet tore through the Kresh forces like a meteor storm through tissue paper, and the Kresh had prepared for another fight with humanity, and they had not prepared for half the galaxy to show up. Species that had never worked together before coordinated their attacks with practiced efficiency, and the Rithani excelled at electronics warfare, and the Porthan's crystalline ships generated interference fields that disrupted crush targeting, and the Draven fought with the fury of the recently saved. And the humans did what humans did best, and they hit hard, and they hit fast, and they didn't stop within 3 hours, and the Kresh fleet was in full retreat. Fleet Commander Zarthex sat in his damaged command, Dr. Oder Kriege chair, and watching his fleet scatter, and knowing his career was over, and knowing that the Kresh Dominion's era of easy expansion had ended. How did this happen? He asked no one in particular. His Second in command had the answer. They meant it, he said quietly. The humans, and when they made their promise, and they actually meant it, and everyone who suffered under our expansion, and everyone who remembered being helpless, and they all meant it too. The Kresh fled, and leaving behind 43 destroyed vessels, and a galaxy that had fundamentally changed on Tertian Station and Administrator. Cove watched the battle end and watched the Allied fleet take up defensive positions around his colony, and watched as the impossible became reality. Communication came through, and Captain Mira of the Velthani fleet, Tertian Station, and this is Captain Mira 7 current. And you are safe now, and the Accords are not just words, and they are a promise, and we keep our promises. Cove broke down weeping, and his entire command staff joining him in relief and gratitude and disbelief that they had called for help, and help had actually come. Commander Torres contacted the Velthani flagship, Captain Mira, and nice flying, and your people have learned well. We had excellent teachers, Mira replied, and excellent reasons to learn. How did you mobilize so fast? Torres asked. We heard someone calling for help, Mira said simply. What else were we supposed to do? Torres laughed, and warm and genuine. You're starting to sound like a human. I will take that as the compliment it is intended to be, Mira responded. Earth, and in the Galactic Council chambers, and across 100 worlds, and the news of the Second Battle of Tertian spread, and the galaxy watched as species that had previously accepted Kresh expansion as inevitable now stood together and fought. And one Ambassador Webb addressed the Council 3 days later. Some of you predicted that the never again Accords would fail at the first real test, he said. Some of you believed that humanity's promise was just rhetoric, and that we would abandon our principles when they became inconvenient. He activated a display showing the Allied fleet's composition: 15 Velthani vessels, and 20 human ships, and 12 Rithani, and 8 Porthan, and 7 Draven, and 4 Telkin, and 4 Telkin, and ships from 9 other species, and all of them arriving within hours of the distress call, all of them willing to fight for people they had never met.